I just got done reading this book, finally, Poland's Holocaust by Tadeusz Piotrowski. I took my time to read this book, read through it quite slowly because I wanted to digest as much of the information as I could. When I read a book, I tend to read it slowly because I want to go through each chapter. A lot of people will speed through a book or they will speed read. I've never done that before. Can't say I've never done it. There have been a few times where I have zipped through a book, but that was almost a decade ago. But I like to read through a book slowly. I like to digest the pages. And this book was difficult to digest. It is about how the Polish people suffered under the Third Reich and the Soviet Union. The book talks about how specifically the non-Jewish people in Poland suffered. It does talk about Jewish suffering, but it focuses mainly on the suffering of ethnic Poles. There are plenty of books that talk about the Holocaust in regards to Jewish suffering, but there aren't a lot of books that deal with how the Polish people, specifically the non-Jewish Poles, suffered. It talks about how the Germans were indeed racist against Slavic people. It wasn't just about killing Jewish people. It was also about butchering Polish people. And when you say Polish people, people will say, well, they were Polish Jews and they were Polish. Yes, they were. They were Polish citizens. There's no doubt about that. But I'm talking specifically about the non-Jewish Poles. In this book, there is a chapter for each of the major collaborators, the different groups that collaborated, either with the Soviets or with the Germans. So it talks about how there were Jews who collaborated with the Soviet Union to kill the Poles and to round them up to be killed or to be sent to the gulags under the reign of terror of the Soviets. It also talks about how there were Lithuanians who collaborated with the Germans to butcher the Poles, how there were Belarusians who collaborated with the Germans to butcher the Poles. There is a chapter about the Belarusian collaborators. There is a chapter about the Jewish collaborators. There is a chapter about the Lithuanian collaborators. The biggest chapter is the one that is dedicated to the Ukrainians, to the Ukrainian fascists who butchered tens of thousands of Polish people. It talks about how there is this reoccurring myth that is promoted by Ukrainian nationalists today, and that is that the Ukrainian nationalists during the Second World War fought against the Nazis. And the book acknowledges this. It says, yes, there were indeed Ukrainians who fought the Germans, but it wasn't for the reasons that the neo-nationalists of today want you to think. They want you to think that they were just valiantly fighting the Germans for the principle of fighting Nazi evil. That wasn't the case. The Ukrainians were extremely racist against Polish people. They hated Polish people. They believed that Poland had stolen territory from the Ukraine, and they wanted to butcher the Polish people who were living in territories that they believed rightfully belonged to the Ukrainian people. The Germans knew this. The Germans had a great understanding of these ethnic tensions, and they exploited them. They took advantage. They capitalized on the situation by training and arming Ukrainian nationalists to help the Third Reich in butchering the Polish people. The Ukrainians gladly received the support from the Germans because they needed the training and they needed the guns. And they also did this because they believed that Germany supported the formation of an independent Ukraine. But the reality was that the Germans were simply using the Ukrainians. The Germans were racist against Slavic people. And the Ukrainians were not exactly exempt from this. Hitler was really quite explicit about this. He said that the purpose of the Slavic race is to serve the Germans. And this was not something that just popped out of Hitler's head during the reign of the Third Reich. This was something that was quite ever present in German political thought and in German nationalist ideology. You can go back to the First World War and you will find similar statements regarding the Slavs. Maybe not as explicit as those of Hitler, but nonetheless, there was a belief, a popular belief, before the First World War, that there was supposed to be almost an apocalyptic war between the Slavic race and the Germanic races, and the Germans were to win and dominate the Slavs. So these beliefs festered and they germinated, and they eventually became the ideological monster that the world witnessed during the Second World War. So the Ukrainians kind of turned against the Germans at one point. But once the Soviets began to advance into the Ukraine, into Poland, the Ukrainian nationalists realized that they needed to work with the Germans. So they stopped fighting the Germans and they went back to collaborating with them, with the Nazis. In their pursuit for Ukrainian supremacy, the Ukrainian nationalists butchered tens of thousands of Polish people. And I think the general consensus is that eventually they butchered around 100,000 Polish people. Now, in the late 90s, I want to say in 1996, the president of Ukraine and the president of Poland got together and they signed a declaration of reconciliation. They signed a mutual declaration. And in this declaration, it acknowledged the massacres of the Polish people under the sadistic hands of the Ukrainian nationalists. The advisors to the president of Ukraine urged the Ukrainian president not to sign this mutual declaration. They did not want the president of Ukraine to acknowledge that the Ukrainian nationalists, be they under Bandera or under Melnik, butchered tens of thousands of Polish civilians. And this was in the 90s. I was alive during this. I was 7 years old. Or maybe 6. I forget which month it was signed. But I was alive. Most of you guys watching this video were alive then. So in our lifetime, Ukraine still, I don't want to say Ukraine, because there were many Ukrainians who wanted to acknowledge this, but in our lifetime, there was a substantial political element within Ukraine that did not want Ukraine to acknowledge this extermination of human beings. Just like there are people in Turkey who don't want Turkey to admit that the Armenian genocide took place. And this is actually the most popular opinion in Turkey in regards to the Armenian genocide. Although there are Turks who do want Turkey to acknowledge that the Armenian genocide was real. But the general consensus, the general conventional view in Turkey is that the Armenian genocide was faked up by the Armenians. So, the reality is that evil, sadistic, sinister spirit still exists in Ukraine today. There was a statement that was made. It was a joint statement that was made by over 90 members of parliament. I want to say this was in 1996. And I want to read to you guys a paragraph from this statement. So this was a joint statement from 95 members of the Ukrainian parliament, made in 1996. And it says here, "We turn to all those who do not wish to see the eventual rebirth and empowerment in Ukraine of the nationalist fascist organizations whose members have never separated themselves from their bloody predecessors, who equate their terrible crimes with heroic deeds, who profess the ideology and practice of integral nationalism, who create detachments of stormtroopers, and who are now making a grab for political power." So it's talking about fascist paramilitaries within Ukraine, and this was written not in 1941 or the 1930s. This was written in 1996. It's still there. It's still present. And we really saw this reality manifest itself in 2014 and in 2015 when the Russians and the Ukrainians were at it again, fighting and killing each other in the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine. And the world witnessed very well-trained, very well-armed men with swastikas and Slavic swastikas, or collaborators as they call them, making Hitler salutes, praising Stefan Bandera, one of the butcherers of the Polish people, and doing torch-lit night processions like their Nazi predecessors. We saw this. And it really goes to show you that it's still there. It is still there. Now, this statement from these 95 members of the Ukrainian parliament from 1996, it talks about these paramilitaries. Now, the paramilitary that we saw in 2014 was called the Azov Battalion, or Right Sector, which is the armed branch of the Nazi political party in Ukraine called Svoboda. But Azov, or Right Sector, is simply a continuation of a group, a paramilitary group, that existed in the 90s. It was known as its acronym, the SNPU, or the Social Union, Social National Party of Ukraine. I'm pretty sure that's what it stands for. The SNPU was the predecessor of Right Sector. And the SNPU was so anti-Russian that they went to Chechnya to back the Chechens to fight the Russians. And they also, during the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the 90s, they also went to the South Caucasus to fight the Armenians on the side of Azerbaijan. So they don't mind working with Muslim fanatics to fight and kill Russia's Christian allies, or to fight and kill Russians themselves. And what's crazy is that Marine Le Pen, who is one of the faces of the far right in France, her father hung out with the SNPU. You can read about this. He hung out with the SNPU. He went to Ukraine. He hung out with these guys. Supported their anti-communist cause. And it really goes to show you that the far right, the nationalist, the ultra-nationalist, in Europe, Eastern Europe, they almost all share this common mentality, this mentality of hatred. And this hatred entails this idea that a particular territory solely belongs to a particular race. And they are obsessed with the idea of homogeneity. They are fixated with the idea of ensuring that the territory is only inhabited by a particular people. Be it France for the French, Ukraine for the Ukrainians, Sweden for the Swedes. Now, I know what you're going to say. There's nothing wrong with these statements. Blah, blah, blah. They're not calling for genocide. They're not directly calling for genocide. They're not. They're not explicitly calling for genocide. They're not. But when you say this one country for this one particular people, ask yourself, how can this not be escalated? What's stopping such an idea from being escalated to the point where Ukraine for Ukrainians doesn't accelerate to, well, Ukraine for Ukrainians must be taken literally, and if you are not Ukrainian, then you don't belong here. What's to say that such an idea would not escalate to that sort of policy? During the Second World War, the Ukrainian nationalists utilized this very phrase, Ukraine for the Ukrainians. And that meant no Jews, no Gypsies, and definitely no Poles. So as we read history, we're not just reading about the distant past. We are reading about a spirit that exists, a mentality, a condition of the soul. One that is dark, sinister, and relentless. It doesn't give up. Even after all the diplomatic statements, even after all of the years since the events of the past have taken place, it's still there, waiting for the right opportunity to revive itself. So, this was an excellent book. I learned a lot from it. And if you are interested in reading about Poland and how Poland suffered during the Holocaust, and if you want to read about the intricacies of Ukrainian nationalism, this is a book for you. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.